Ata Maria, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today about the future of land transport. Now, I think somewhere up there might be written my title, which it's a very policy kind of job title I've been given at the Ministry of Transport. It means I do a policy job. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is we get to deal with the things that are going on now, as well as positioning those and where they're going to take us over the longer term. So that makes this role really interesting. It's how transport works too. So if you think about what's happening at the moment, we're stewarding about $8.8 billion this year in the transport system, which is quite a lot of money. Most of that, so there's some of it which goes into looking after things that are in the system now, but most of that goes into building the world in which we, our children and their children are going to live. So depending on the sorts of choices that we make, that's about $8.8 billion of opportunity that's sitting there right in the system today and can enrich people's lives over decades. So the Ministry of Transport, much like transport infrastructure itself, does quite a lot of connecting. We connect what's happening today with the longer term. We do that through planning. We're an economic regulator. We're a steward for the transport regulatory system. We're a funder, and we buy things for the government from time to time. So we work with others and help governments to invest in the future that best meets their objectives, which is really what a lot of policy advice is about. This year, transport's deep connections into all aspects of our lives have actually been really clear. So I remember a conversation in about March of this year, a bunch of public servants in a room asking the question, if we had to shut the borders and stop things from moving around, what would the impact of that be? And just before I get underway, one of the things I really want to do is recognise the enormous effort by people in the transport system and around it to manage the impacts of COVID-19. So like many others, we are working really hard on the problems of today, but today's invitation is to talk about the future. And that's an opportunity to talk about some of the work that's underway to capture the future in the advice that we give to governments, today's government and future governments. So while what I'm talking about today is not government policy, it is the stuff that will inform that in future. So first, I'm going to talk about work that's been underway for a couple of years to plan transport investments out 30 years and longer. That's quite a hard project, and we've kind of kept our heads down and got on with it for a little while. So it's quite good news from our perspective that we're able to talk about where that has got us to today, and it's a thing called the generational investment approach. So it is a tool that governments will be able to use to make the transport pipeline longer and smarter, and to give confidence to communities and businesses about their role in that process. Secondly, I see Stephen is here, and he'll be happy that I'm going to talk about how we pay for the transport system in the future. And lastly, I'll talk about how we're having to work a bit differently to deal with some of these really hard generational problems that are coming into the system, like decarbonising transport. So like Hamish, I want to make outcomes great again. So this is an outcomes slide. I probably won't do it with Hamish's panache, but there we go. I'm going to go back to early 2018 to start, when the ministry started to think about the connections between transport and wellbeing. We were seeing multiple incoming challenges that were going to be really complex to address through choices and action over decades. Those choices would have substantial ripple effects on future generations, and we kind of didn't want to screw that up. We wanted to make choices clearer, and they get really complex in the transport system. So the ministry put together what you see behind me, a thing called the Transport Outcomes Framework. It's now used by all of the government transport agencies. It is the reference point for all of our advice. We can connect it to everything that happens in transport, and we can track results against 37 indicators that sit underneath it. The outcomes don't set a vision for the transport system. Elected governments will always get to do that. But in the context of infrastructure, the outcomes framework reflects our understanding that the planning of transport is about how we connect people, infrastructure and well-being. The outcomes have been very successful, often because of the collective leadership of the transport agencies like Waka Kotahi, who have adopted them and are using them broadly so that they pull the system together. These have been a part of work that you will have seen over the past little while to establish some already longer-term planning approaches for transport. One of those is the first New Zealand Rail Plan. That sets out the government's intentions for heavy rail over 10 years including a $4.6 billion program of rail investment to bring heavy rail to what we call a resilient and reliable state. That's a really big step forward, and we're considering how we can build on that to get even longer-term approaches in the freight system. And increasingly, there are other longer-term plans in place, like the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which is a place-based agreement between central and local government. So that brings us to the present day. Having done all of that, we know that our existing approaches are good for taking us out about 10 to 15 years. People would like to see us do something over even the longer term, which is a really fair expectation, and it raises the challenge, what would it look like to have a straightforward, collaborative and evidence-based way to deal with an uncertain future? To meet that challenge, we've been working for about 18 months on how our transport outcomes can shape and frame the advice we give to governments on how today's choices shape the future and how we can look from today out to 30 or even 50 years. This approach has been created with a number of partners. Together we started with a framework called Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis that was developed by the London School of Economics. MCDA is designed for making choices where there are multiple objectives that might conflict, mixed information, and where there is no single optimal solution. We've taken MCDA and built it into a Transport and New Zealand specific solution and process that will be used by multiple agencies, jointly owned and widely shared. We've called it the Generational Investment Approach, or GIA. That reflects that we're in policy, not marketing, but it does describe what the thing does. It uses the transport outcomes, which describe public benefit, which is what transport is often about, as its criteria for dealing with evidence and comparing potential options. This means we now have a tool that can help us to put forward choices based on the outcomes they enable per dollar adjusted for risk. That was another geek moment. The GIA can frame and evaluate options for transport investment down to the level of key choices, including projects for decision makers. We intend to identify those through engagement with communities. It also recognises that decision makers will want to bring values and preferences to the choices that are theirs to make. This reflects that many different futures are possible depending on the values we bring. One person's yellow brick road is another person's yellow-lined busway. The GIA is our tool for thinking about how do we get to tomorrow's transport map given one or other set of objectives. Infrastructure can be greener or smarter, we can be leading edge, we can follow fast, or we can wait. Infrastructure can encourage participatory communities or ask communities to sort that out for themselves. It can be a lever on social difference, health, the way places grow, whether we want to be an import nation or an export nation, and how the fortunes of one place might be made to compare to those of another. Those choices all constitute our systems of infrastructure, including transport. There is no set of choices, particularly longer-term choices, that is free of values or preferences, but we can make them transparent, and we think we can offer at least some of them up earlier than we do now. During its development, the GIA methodology has already been used in a number of transport projects. Examples include work on the government's portfolio of heavy rail investments, evaluating large numbers of shovel-ready and stimulus projects, and helping with the current refresh of the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. It has worked better than we'd hoped. It's always good when that happens. And we have decided it is ready to start using it in the broader way that we'd always wanted to. This will mean having some conversations about what the future could be and how we will start to work our way back from where we'd like to go. That isn't something we always do. Traditionally, transport planning has been about what we build after what we have now, assuming that the past, will continue into the future. And often when it comes to thinking about the future, New Zealanders are very stoic and we're very pragmatic. So we have been really pleased to find people who are trying to start these same conversations in the Infrastructure Commission. The Commission talked a little bit yesterday about some of the work we've done together, and this is part of their work on the New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy. I want to thank them for the work that they've done with us. We think they make a real difference when they create coalitions of the willing out of the infrastructure agencies and help us to do things that would have been much harder to do on our own. To briefly recap, the start of our work has been to engage with the Chief Science Advisors. Most government departments have a Chief Science Advisor. They're usually senior academics who spend some of their time with a government department. Ours is Professor Simon Kingham, a geography professor at the University of Canterbury. We think it's very appropriate at the moment that in transport we have a Chief Science Advisor who studies places. We and the Infrastructure Commission have engaged with the advisors as a group, facilitated by a leading futures thinker, to produce something that will start conversations on the things that will shape New Zealand's future. So it starts with 4 scenarios, from no change to radical change, and 4 dimensions of a vision. Public servants will not decide our vision for the future, but we do need to understand where Kiwis agree and disagree about what our future should be, so we can consider the role transport and infrastructure can play. 4 themes emerged, which are very New Zealand themes. They are the global context, or New Zealand's place in the world, social context, or thriving communities, governance context, led by inclusion, and the technology context, where we would like to live smarter. And we will go through all of this, and I suspect I will still predict that in 30 to 50 years' time we will still almost have fully autonomous vehicles. But we have some very practical uses for this product. We will use it as a starting point for discussions with local government, tangata whenua, industry, young people and others to fill out our picture of the future they want and talk about the things that will enable it. It's a big job, and we are looking at implementation as we are able to over the next while. But if done well, we can get on top of what some of our future choices are and enable the big things, like projects and services, to be talked about earlier, alongside whether the things we have in our system today are fit for purpose in the future, like our revenue system. This can give us earlier choices about how we pay for things and the ability to start sooner if we want to. It is also possible that better conversations about the future will mean there can be some agreement on the things that are important. This will have impacts in the present day because of the long legacy of choices. Take the government policy on land transport, which is the government's key plan for the land transport system. Each GPS covers up to 10 years, which is decided and delivered on by Waka Kotahi. Each GPS is increasingly framed by bigger strategies, so Nicole talked about Road to Zero, which has a life of about 7 to 15 years. What we want to be able to do is frame those in a longer term picture that gets into the lives of communities and infrastructure. Knowing what we want to do in the future also enables us to ask clearer questions about how we'll pay. So that brings me to the land transport revenue system. An old view of the future, or a used view if you like, is baked into today's land transport revenue system, which dates back to the introduction of road user charges in 1977. If we'd asked about the longer term in 1977, people would have talked a lot about cars. There was no GPS, either kind of GPS, or mobile payment systems, or the new business models they've enabled like Uber. Our revenue system is still a really good one when compared internationally. It does a lot for a small country with a long, thin, craggy geography. But for us, fuel taxes and road user charges can be understood as part of a system that assumes transport will connect towns and small cities, usually with roads, with public transport effectively running as a small operation on the side. These assumptions are increasingly being challenged. Cities are getting bigger, vehicles and travel patterns are changing, and we have to make investments in intergenerational assets like city-shaping, people-moving mass transit systems. I could not say that 10 times fast. But so even before we get anywhere near the AI and the flying cars, there are challenges that we will have to consider. As part of our planning for the future of the transport system and the land transport system, the Ministry is planning for how we will pay. This project is underway, but in its early stages, and some of you will already have talked to us about it in some form. This is one of very few projects where we get to start with a blank page. Work on a future revenue system has to reflect the type of society we want to live in and how transport enables that and how we pay for those things to happen. One way of thinking about what a good future revenue system is that it mirrors the transport system we want it to pay for. It may be very different from today's system, or it may have similarities in ways that surprise us. Decisions on that work will be for the current government and for future governments, but our policies work will have to consider the broader objectives for transport, who the beneficiaries of what gets delivered are, and what is the nature of the value that is created. And I guess I'd observe those are all questions which are very differently answered today from what they would have been 5 or 10 years ago. These start as big questions, but one of the challenges for us is that they become very practical very quickly. And getting it right will matter. We've started early with the time needed to get things right and potentially learn from changes that we may want to make in the shorter term. My last point today is that new challenges in transport, like climate change, are requiring us to help shape change rather than just think about it. The work we're doing increasingly requires high levels of engagement with communities, industry, treaty partners, academia and others. That makes sense to us as a small policy ministry like MOT. We're one of the smallest government departments, so everything we do relies on partnerships with someone else or a bunch of other people, and we want that to be an opportunity for us. A really good recent example has been the Green Freight project. Green Freight 2020 is a working paper, which means it is work we do to inform our policy advice and to share insights with others. It has been clear that a real challenge for our long, thin, craggy geography would be decarbonising the long-haul road freight industry that is such a good fit for it. Transport accounts for about 20% of New Zealand's total emissions, sitting only behind the dairy industry. If we did nothing, we estimate that by 2055, road freight would be the main contributor to road-based greenhouse gas emissions. We got out in 2019 to talk to the industry about 3 fuels initially: biofuels, electricity and green hydrogen. Officials had something to offer, which was a good understanding of the technologies and the sorts of things that governments can do to help. The Ministry has a small team that looks at future technologies and innovation, but none of them happen to run a freight business. The freight industry knows its business and its business models, what their owners and customers want, and they know firsthand the challenges of making change in such a large and diverse industry. The Green Freight working paper is the result of extensive work between the Ministry and the freight sector. It reflects what can happen when perspectives are brought together to look for a good pathway through real complexity. In this case, the Green Freight project has reinvigorated the discussion on how biofuels could help reduce emissions in the shorter term. We have a much richer understanding of the choices around batteries and hydrogen, what the critical decision points will be from the perspective of others, and how we can help. This is informing an overarching emissions plan for transport. The Ministry is producing a comprehensive Transport Emissions Action Plan, the TEAP, that will look right across the transport system and set out the choices that can take us to our emissions reduction targets. This has been a big effort for many people with extensive engagement, and it will be available in the coming months. It will be a good example of the kind of comprehensive, system-wide, long-term approach that's needed to deal with these sorts of problems. The partnered approach that is generated extends to many other new and recent projects, including longer-term place-based projects with local communities and government partners. One of these, and it's my last example today, is the Hamilton to Auckland corridor, where we are looking at the potential value of a new high-speed rail service. We've worked with many others to understand the full range of outcomes that are possible, how transport can change the economic relationships between places over decades, and how good design can shape the future that we want with the right infrastructure at the right time. As part of that work, we're developing reusable models that can help us to understand the value of transit projects to their corridors, their broader places, and the transport network overall over their life. That will enable us to prioritise projects like this, but in the context of engagement with the people who have to live there, work out where they are needed, and make sure all options are considered. So in finishing, I want to go back to a point I made at the start. Transport and infrastructure are key to our national well-being. Transport brings with it a rich set of connections, but also some really hard choices. And as with transport itself, or a journey on our transport system itself, having a good idea of your preferred destination is part of knowing how you'd like to set out. Our work on our current long-term choices is the work of just a few people, given all the current day challenges that we have. But it's important. We're excited about the start that we've made and the opportunities that we see opening up. And as you will have heard today, this work will be strengthened by all the voices of our partners and stakeholders. So a slide advertising the work of some of our partners is a really good place for us to leave things. We look forward to engaging with you on this work and the things that will be possible. Thank you, everybody.